speaking of California, there's a bill on the governor's desk right now, and it's Assembly Bill 2098. And that bill will allow the Medical Board of California, our MD licensing board, all members of which are appointed by the governor. That bill will allow the Medical Board of California to sanction and come after the licenses of doctors that spread, in their opinion, misinformation or disinformation. And they define that actually in the bill, misinformation. They define it as, I'm paraphrasing, but something like going against the scientific medical consensus. And it's ridiculous, because science is not about consensus. It's actually the opposite. It's about challenging consensus. It's about arguing and debate and ultimately testing a variety of hypotheses to see which one is correct. But as soon as you silence voices that disagree, you no longer have silence. You no longer have science. You have totalitarianism. And that's very dangerous. It's not good, and it's not healthy. I've been reading some articles this morning and preparing for an interview that I'm doing this afternoon on all-cause mortality, meaning we know COVID killed some people, and there's an expected number of deaths every year just from, going about our business, and cancer and heart disease and so forth. But what about, is there death above and beyond the expected deaths? And I don't mean people that die of COVID, people that have died from unrelated illnesses, has nothing to do with COVID, heart disease, cancer, whatever. And the number of excessive deaths is staggering. It's almost record based. There is a quote that said a 10% increase in all-cause mortality above the expected is a 1 in 200 year catastrophic event. It's so rare that we see a significant increase in all-cause mortality. Well, what we're seeing now is not a 10%. We're seeing a 40% increase in all-cause mortality in some age groups, and nobody is talking about it. It's silent. And we don't know what's causing this, but there's speculation that this is the post-vaccine effect, meaning these aren't deaths from COVID. And by the way, we know during the pandemic, if you got in a car, if you were killed in a car crash and in the hospital while they're reviving you, they test you for COVID and you're positive, then that death is recorded as a COVID death, right? Ridiculous. So we're aware of all these over categorization of everybody that dies from COVID that wasn't really COVID. But these deaths in all-cause mortality have nothing to do with COVID. These are deaths from everything else that do not have a diagnosis of COVID. And in some categories, it's up as high as 40% above expected baseline, which is unheard of and never seen before. So for example, if you look at the VAERS system, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, this is a system that's run by the CDC and the FDA. And it's been poo-pooed as being not accurate and so forth. Fine. But let's just look at comparative data. So for example, post-COVID shots, there's been 284 reported cases of breast cancer. Now, it's not cause and effect. It's a casual relationship. It's not necessarily causation, it's correlation. You go, okay, fine. Well, what about all the other vaccines? Well, if you look at all the other vaccines combined together over the history of the entire VAERS system, many, many years, like 20 plus years, there's only been 350 cases of breast cancer reported following vaccine. So again, 350, the entire history of VAERS, 284 simply as a result of COVID. I mean, that's staggering. The same thing is true of leukemia and other illnesses as well, and a variety of conditions. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody is actually talking about this. And then how accurate is VAERS? Well, there was a study out of Harvard years ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, called the Lazarus study. You can look it up. And the researchers took data from a big giant HMO out of Harvard. And they said, okay, let's look at the electronic data of all the reported serious vaccine injuries or side effects. This is electronic data, not government data. And they looked at all that and they go, okay, got it. Now let's take those and see how many of those serious vaccine injuries were reported to the VAERS system. How accurate is VAERS? Is it over-reporting? Is it under-reported? What's going on with that? And they discovered only about 1% of all serious vaccine side effects or injuries were reported to the VAERS system. So the VAERS system is dramatically underreporting any side effect injury related to vaccines. And we know this is going on. I'm seeing it in my own practice. We're seeing it across the country, but nobody is talking about it in legacy media. They're silent. They don't want to report that there are signals suggesting that these vaccines are causing more harm than good. We're seeing it everywhere. They're not stopping infection. They're not stopping transmission. To the extent around the margins that they prevent serious disease, fine. But what about the long-term effects of these vaccines impairing the immune system and causing other problems? And that's what this all-cause mortality data is suggesting.
Crazy.
I'm just wondering, after this recording airs this Sunday, if we're going to be heard on the air the following Sunday, based on what the doc just said.
Oh man, doctor, and also, I mean, I think I might have read this past week or last week. Something about Harvard came out with a study saying that the vaccine actually could be more harmful than getting COVID. I think that I just saw that. I don't know if you saw that, but
no, I did see it, and I think you're not allowed to say it, but I think it's true. In my own practice, some of the people that are most ill from COVID are those that have been vaccinated. And the ones that are unvaccinated that get COVID usually do really well because they have an intact immune system.
Yeah, I had it for 5 days, very mild, like 5 weeks ago, and I did not get vaccinated ever. Never plan on getting vaccinated.
I've got a patient. They're a couple, husband and wife, and they're visiting in New York. They've got a small house in New York that they go to, and they both now have come down with COVID. And we're treating them with the usual medications. Very difficult to find in New York, by the way. Ivermectin is almost impossible to find in New York. The standard pharmacies like CVS, Walgreens in New York, they have Duane Reade. That's a big pharmacy chain. They refuse to dispense ivermectin. So they found a mom and pop pharmacy in Chinatown, of all places.
Wow.
And we were able to get the ivermectin there. They're now about 3-4 days in, and they're both doing well. They're recovering nicely. Put them on ivermectin, the usual nutraceuticals, Z-Pak, some steroids, nose, throat, rinse protocol, and they're doing fine. Had we had the ability to use these repurposed medications without restrictions early on, I think we could have saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives.
Unbelievable.
Dr. Jeffrey Barker.
Dr. Barke, I mean, honestly, let's get into it a little bit here, because I'm also reading some other thing. Actually, you know what? Forget that. Let's get right to the main subject here that I wanted to bring up. President Biden claims COVID is done. The pandemic is over.
Yeah.
We just saw that. The world saw it. He announced it. Yet you've got governors like your governor, not my governor anymore, but your governor, say, still threatening, certain mandates. And he's, I don't know what's going on, but, I feel like one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing. But in your humble opinion, is the pandemic, if it ever was, is it over?
Well, it's been over for a long time. I mean,
Thank you.
The CDC, by the way, even told us that. They changed their guidelines now 3 weeks ago. And it's very telling what they've done, the CDC. And remember, to your audience, the CDC, 50% of the funding of the CDC comes from the pharmaceutical industry. You should know that. Same with the FDA. So the CDC changed their guidelines. And they said, by the way, people that have no symptoms no longer need to be tested. Did the science change to tell us that? No. We've known asymptomatic people rarely, if ever, spread this illness. The World Health Organization told us that even early in the pandemic. But what we have to remember is the predicate upon which all the draconian lockdown tricks were implemented was the idea that asymptomatic spread was a thing. So the reason why we closed schools, remember, is we were told that little Johnny would come to school feeling fine, but he would spread the illness to his other students, spread the illness to his teachers, and then all those kids and adults would bring it home and kill grandma and grandpa. Therefore, we have to close down the schools and isolate everybody. Well, now the CDC is saying, well, just kidding. That's actually not a thing. Well, we knew that wasn't a thing. It was the reason why we masked everybody. We said, sorry you feel good, but you got to wear a mask because you might actually have the illness and you can spread it to other people. So everybody and their mother has to wear a mask, including on airplanes when you're sitting 3 inches away from people.
Right.
So the mask charade was under the guise also of asymptomatic spread. And that never was a thing. And the CDC now is acknowledging it. Do you think anybody's going to lose their job at the CDC? You think there's going to be any ramifications as a result of that? No, of course not. There is never any holding to account of people that have made these kind of mistakes.
Yeah.
And now here we are. You still see, I'm sure less so in Texas, although I was out there, a month or so ago visiting my dad. And although it's rare, but occasionally you'll see that lone person with a mask on their face, or a waiter or waitress still wearing a mask. But you see that all the time out here in the communist country of California. And
Oh, we're not going to make it. We're not going to make it to the airways in 2 weeks.
And speaking of being censored, I saw this funny meme a friend of mine posted, something like, if you're worried about liking my post means the FBI is going to knock on your door, it said, don't worry, because the FBI doesn't knock on your door.
Right. Yeah.
Like, okay, perfect.
That's President Trump.
Oh, geez.
Hey, Doc, any comments or concerns that the rumor is Dr. Fauci is retiring finally?
Well, Fauci told us that himself, and he will retire, but he will be held to account. So when Republicans take over at least the House of Representatives, there will be investigations, and Fauci will be the center of that, both for his malfeasance during COVID-19, his role that he and his National Institutes of Health played in paying for and promoting gain of function research at the Wuhan virology lab. So there needs to be an accounting, and Fauci is at the center of that. And if you haven't read it, you should, but Bobby Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, lays it all out, and not just about COVID, but Fauci's entire history. He did something very similar during the AIDS epidemic back in the 90s, where he suppressed medications that were cheap and effective over dangerous medications that were being brought forward by his pharma buddies that he and his agencies were profiting from.
Crazy.
Well,
That's crazy.
all I know is that Senator and Dr. Rand out of Kentucky can't wait to see November come fast enough. He's gonna get his fill.
Yeah, let's hope so. Rand Paul and Senator Ron Johnson, I think they will be at the forefront of these investigations.
Yeah.
Two of the best senators that have actually been questioning the science and shedding a light on what's actually going on.
Personal concierge physicians, you move. You're not, are you in Corona Del Mar now?
We're in Corona Del Mar. We moved from, it's still all in Greater Newport Beach, but we moved from one office to another.
It's weird how, like, the last couple years, I mean, we've talked nothing but COVID, and it's like, is the flu around? I mean, my son, both of my kids in the last 30 to 50 days have had strep. Okay. And there's other illnesses out there. In fact, it was really funny out here, going out to either seeing our doctor or urgent care, and a lot of the nurses and even the physicians are saying, look, at strep's actually, you can get that a lot faster, and it's more prevalent, and actually it's you gotta, it's just, I don't know, they weren't really worried about COVID as much as strep. It's crazy, and other illnesses.
Yeah, remember during the pandemic we saw almost no flu.
Yeah.
And why was that? It's not clear, but some of the PCR testing, the FDA removed some of this PCR testing from market because they weren't able to differentiate between COVID and influenza. So I think a lot of what we were seeing early on that we said was COVID was actually influenza. Of course, flu vaccines are now appearing on the market for this upcoming flu season. And once again, as is the case every year, we're told that this is going to be the worst flu season in history and that you should go out and get the flu shot. And when you look at the data for the flu shot, at best, in a really good year, it's only about 30% effective, and more likely in the single digits. So they keep getting it wrong. They, being the FDA, keeps getting it wrong year in and year out, yet they still push it on everybody to go get their flu shot. And The enormous amount of money in these vaccines is staggering, and it's hard not to believe that there's some level of corrupt influence by the money. And for your audience, if you know nothing else about the vaccine industry, if this was the only thing you knew, you should be skeptical. And that is, every single vaccine company that's pushing these vaccines, be it COVID or flu or shingles or pneumonia or all the childhood illnesses, measles, mumps, rubella, tetanus, etc., all these vaccine companies are immune from liability.
Yeah.
And what that means is, if you're injured by a vaccine, and it happens all the time, there is no recourse against any of the vaccine companies.
That's crazy.
And so if you're a company and you have no liability for the product that you're putting to market, what exactly is your incentive to go overboard to make sure that you're putting forward a product that is both safe and effective? I mean, would you get into a car if you knew whatever your car, Ford, whatever it is, if you knew Ford had no liability for the product, so if something went wrong and there's a manufacturer defect, that they had no liability, it would make you pretty skeptical to want to hop into that car, use any product for that matter. And for some reason, we did this years ago, and maybe it made sense years ago, but it no longer makes sense. We need to remove that liability protection and allow the industry to face the public and to face the scrutiny to make sure their products are safe and effective.
I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like the pharmaceutical industry has been around forever, since before I was born. And I feel like, they're doing what they're doing. And they're making some drugs actually that really help. And, but here's the thing that I think, or if you want to point your finger at someone, I just feel like it's the media, because I feel like they've really put fear into people from the day one when this started, and didn't realize, or didn't allow us to realize, that our body can fight illness just like, or, a lot of illness, just like, it's been doing for years with the flu and whatnot. And, I mean, look, at everyone's got their, their certain problems health wise, and whether it's obesity or whatever it is. And maybe that has a major issue when it comes to fighting COVID. Maybe it makes it a lot harder to fight. But at the end of the day, I mean, when you're watching people who don't even take any meds when they have COVID and they're healing, maybe it takes a little longer, because honestly, the cocktail that you prescribed me was phenomenal. Like, I had my wife, she didn't have hydroxychloroquine with her ivermectin. I had that great cocktail that you gave me. I was better in like two days. She was in bed for like 5-6 days, because I don't know what it was. But at the end of the day, I'm a huge believer of medicine, of the medicine that you prescribed. But here's the thing: people are getting better without medicine when it comes to COVID too, and I just over-the-counter drugs. That's all they're taking,
Right.
and I just feel like, we were not advised properly. We weren't, we were scared to death, and just totally just said that you're going to die. You are going to die if you don't get this vaccine, and I mean, I can't believe it. I was dropping my son off to school today, and there was one kid walking into school with a mask on here in Dallas. One out of, hundreds and hundreds of kids. And that's, I think, because the parents are just scared.
Fear is a big thing. You're right about the media. And if you look at the media, the problem with the media, in part, there's a lot of problems, but they're sponsored by pharma.
Okay.
So, you look at the Anderson Cooper show, and this segment sponsored by Pfizer, etc. Even the medical journals, there have been problems. The most prestigious medical journal in this country is probably the New England Journal of Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And if you grab the New England Journal of Medicine, it's hard to read. I used to get it. It's very esoteric. It's very academic. It's not, it's not easy reading. But if you look through it and just thumb through the pages, every 10th page or so, there's a full page ad from pharma. They are sponsored and supported by the pharmaceutical industry. I wrote an article about this called COVID-19 Follow the Money.
Mm-hmm.
You can find it on my website, RX for Liberty. It was published in the American Thinker. And it's all about the money and the pharmaceutical industry. And I get accused all the time of being anti-big pharma, whatever. Obviously there are life-saving drugs that we need to come to market, but too often we push drugs that are unneeded and unnecessary. Statins, everybody, your cholesterol's a little high, take a statin. Even though there's little evidence to support it, except in a very narrow range of patients, somebody who's had a heart attack, for example, or SSRIs, Prozac, Lexapro, Celexa, for example. Articles recently show that the idea that there's a chemical imbalance in the brain that is restored by these medications turns out actually not to be a thing, and that we're causing, in many cases, more harm than good. So there's a role for pharmaceutical companies, but they're too big, too powerful. And when you look at the money, Big Pharma is the #1 lobbyer in the federal government. #1 by far. What's next in line after Big Pharma? Well, Big Oil. Big Pharma spends 3 times more money than the oil industry lobbying the federal government, and almost 4 times more than the education industry. We think of, these teachers unions that spend enormous amounts to influence legislation. They do, but Big Pharma pales in how much they spend. These companies pale in comparison to Big Pharma. So we should fix that. We should remove these insidious influences. In the CDC and the FDA, we should remove funding from them, except from taxpayer money. They're supposed to have the back of the American people. They're supposed to work FDA, Food and Drug Administration. They're supposed to oversee industry on behalf of the American people. Well, how can we legitimately believe what they're doing when most of their funding, not most, but about 50% of their funding comes from the industries that they're overseeing? I mean, look at it this way. What if we took the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was funded by ExxonMobil? Would we have a lot of confidence in whatever not that we have a lot of confidence anyways, but would we have a lot of confidence in the EPA if they were funded by ExxonMobil? No, of course not. And that's why even in healthcare, it's so important that you find a doctor that isn't funded by their local healthcare institution. Too many doctors now are working for these big healthcare institutions. So they can only refer to doctors that are in network in that institution. They order labs, they order x-rays. Everything they do is within that captured group. They're biased. Their paycheck is coming from the institution, so they have to follow the institution's protocols. You need a doctor that's independent, that gets paid by you, the customer, so has your best interest. They can refer you to whoever the hell they want that thinks meets your best needs. They can order blood tests, lab tests, x-rays from the place that they think serves you best because they work for you, not for the paycheck from the healthcare bureaucracy.
Letters and emails to Dr. Jeffrey Barke.
I love him. You know what? At the end of the day, you're speaking just truth, and we appreciate obviously what you do, what you continue to do, and we love having you on the show. I definitely want to have you back sooner than later, and we'll get into certain things. Like I'm hearing that COVID might be mutating into something else. Who knows? There's so much to talk about.
China.
But at the end of the day, we got to live our life, right?
Yeah. Well, listen, let me leave you with this because I think it's important. First of all, RX for Liberty is my website. There's a way to contact me. I respond to every email that comes in through my website, but we're seeing the rollout of this new vaccine, the so-called Omicron variant vaccine. Use great caution if you're considering that, because this vaccine has not been tested for efficacy. There were no human trials that tested to see if this vaccine actually works. And we've never used 2 strains of COVID together in one vaccine. There's no safety or efficacy trials. And yet we're rolling this out as if it's been tested and true under emergency use authorization. Remember, emergency use authorization, President Biden just told us there is no more emergency. So how do you authorize a vaccine under emergency use authorization when there is no emergency? And we have very effective medications to treat this illness. So there should be no EUA vaccine that's being rolled out. We should not allow a vaccine to be rolled out that hasn't been tested. This potentially could be a dangerous product, so be very, very careful. And under no circumstances should a child receive this COVID vaccine. The death rate for a child, the mortality rate for a child for COVID is 0%. So it doesn't make sense to vaccinate a child against an illness they're not at risk using an experimental product that has no long-term safety studies. So mom and dad, don't let your kid grow up to be a cowboy, and don't let them get a COVID-19 vaccine.
Especially a
I
Dallas,
love it, especially a Dallas Cowboy. Exactly.
Isn't
Hey,
there a
Doc.
song about that or something?
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
Good seeing you, Doc.
You too.
Dr. Jeffrey Barke. You can address your emails to him.
I love it.
Down in Southern California.
More to come. Living the Good Life show. We'll be right back, everyone.